Hello everyone and welcome to this virtual instance of the Advanced Integrations with NoSQL breakout. So for you who don't know me, my name is Michael Gustafsson. I work as a lead VSI domain specialist in EMEA. So what that means is that I primarily focus on workspace intelligence, security, and authentication. So I'm going to kind of bring you through this session and explain why all of this makes sense and why this information might be of use for you. So this session is going to cover a quite custom topic actually. So this has not been something really, or this way of thinking when it comes to the micro app service hasn't really been conveyed in the official documentation and the official marketing. So I'm going to start with kind of why this makes sense, right? And to do that, we need to start off by talking about the different integration types that we offer in the micro app service. And as well as when we might stumble upon some quite non-standard customer requirements. And that is quite naturally going to lead us into a use case, because out of these requirements and the use case, we're going to have a look at an actual custom retail system that then tailors to the use of NoSQL. So we're going to cover NoSQL versus traditional SQL. So what is NoSQL, the kind of key differences, and why NoSQL suits the needs we have in this particular case. With that said, though, this is not going to be a database deep dive or building your own application logic type type session. So this is going to more cover the basics and just broaden your view essentially of what's possible with the actual micro app service. So when we brought you through the whys and the use case and the SQL, we're going to have a look at the technical concept that we are discussing here, as well as actually having a look at building this and demo the actual functionality as well. So building your own integrations, why and when would that make sense? So with the launch of the micro app service, we essentially market two types of integrations. We have the template integrations, or we refer to them as out-of-box integrations as well as something called an HTTP integration, which is essentially used for you to create your own integration as well as your own micro apps, as you hopefully know by now. But is this the entire truth, though? I mean, there can actually be more ways to look at this, and the way we actually talk about this might be slightly confusing, actually, if you're a techie, because when we talk about the template integrations versus HTTP integrations, that almost sounds like there's a difference between them in ways of protocol and data transfer, right? But that's not the truth, actually. I mean, all our integrations actually build on the HTTP protocol, right? And we use JSON in order to transfer data back and forth. And the same goes, of course, for what is the custom HTTP integration. So let's just quickly whiteboard this out and see if we can actually make this make a bit more sense. So let me just activate the pen here. There we go. As I mentioned, we often talk about, first off, what we call the template integrations. And when you have the template integrations, what that essentially mean is that we at Citrix want to ease the onboarding process for you. So in order to actually ease the onboarding process, we're going to predefine and kind of hard code a lot of stuff for you. So when you use an out-of-box or template integration, you're going to have predefined API endpoints. So you most likely do not have to actually understand how the API gives you the data or how that presents the data for you, under what API endpoints can I grab what data and such. You're also going to have predefined relationships. So you do not have to actually create those relationships in between tables and such by yourself. All of that has been predefined for by us and our developers, as well as all the actions that you might have on a specific system, right? So if you want to submit PTO, as an example, when you use the template integrations, all of those actions are already predefined for you, and the list goes on actually, right? So when it comes to the micro apps, you're also going to have predefined content. So all the pages that you might want to use, right? So the different way of displaying the data, or different action pages or input pages, all of those are already pre-built and hard-coded by our developers, right? As well as you might have different notifications for different systems, and all of those has also already been pre-built, and the rules and everything surrounding the notification has already been set up. So that's worth remembering, right? And all of this is, of course, using the HTTP protocol as well. But when it comes to what we refer to as the HTTP integration, that actually means that you have to manually define a few things, right? So you need to actually have an understanding of the schemas and the data structure of the system of record you are connecting to. So you need to understand, okay, so what API endpoint actually presents what data to me, what data is of interest, and how am I actually going to build all of this, right? So the API endpoints you're going to have an understanding of, as well as know how those work for the system of record that you are connecting to. As well as, of course, if there's any relationships you need to configure, you're going to have to manually add those, of course. And if you want some actions, you're going to have to define those as well. So this button is going to submit this specific data containing these specific variables, right? And you are, of course, also going to have to manually build the actual UI and the interactions in the micro app builder, right? So essentially everything surrounding the micro app you also have to build. So what if we take this one step further, right? If we use an empty database as our system of record, what would that mean? Because in this case, you would not actually have to connect to a predefined schema or a predefined data structure, right? This means that you are manually gonna, of course, you're gonna manually, of course, build all the endpoints. You are also going to be creating the actual schema of the data you want, right? You're also, of course, just as before, also going to add your own actions. You're going to have to build your own micro apps. As well, and everything surrounding the micro apps, of course. So what does this actually mean then? Well, since we have created our schema manually, since we are connecting to an empty database, you would, of course, specify all the details of your app. And in some sense, we have actually created an abstraction layer for very crude and simple programming, right? Because what we've done is created a drag and drop type interface for you in order to create data input to an app. We also have a drag and drop type interface in order for you to create data manipulation, right? And you specify the schema or the data structure that you are connecting to. So in some sense of the word, it is actually an abstraction layer to some basic programming. So there's essentially three ways you could utilize this service, essentially. So you can have the template integration, and the only thing you actually supply is your credentials for the service accounts. You can have the HTTP integrations, where you actually connect to a predefined data structure or data schema. And if you use an empty database that accepts REST calls, so might be MySQL with a REST wrapper around it, or in our case for this demo, we're going to use RESTDB.io to grab and send JSON data to the actual database. So moving on. What if a customer wants to be able to actually send, store, and manipulate data when there is no actual system of record, right? So a customer might ask you for a good use case could be a suggestion inbox, right? So you want a suggestion inbox where employees can request or send suggestions to management for improvements around health maybe, or conditions at work, or whatever the case might be. And then you want to notify someone, right? So that's a pretty spot on use case. Now, there might not be a system of record, so to speak, for this, for you to integrate with in order to use all of this in the micro app service. But in this case, using this kind of thinking or methodology that we're going to walk through here, you're actually going to be able to build your own type application from the start. So essentially what I'm saying is that you can actually do more with this service than what we've told you so far. Also, I just want to mention this again, this session, or the focus of the session, is not the actual logic of the back end or front end, or how you would go about to build this app. Is this app secure, or whatever the case might be, right? The idea of this session is just to kind of broaden your horizon and to show you more things that you can do with the actual micro app service. So let's have a quick look at a customer use case where a customer where you or a customer might need to build an integration, and it would make sense to use NoSQL, right? So in this case, we have a customer where the customer already has some sort of open source / homebrew retail software due to their legacy, and they have no intentions of actually changing this, right? So they might already have a web front end or a web back end for this, right? And because of this fact that it's open source or homebrew, the customer is actually afraid to expose it over the internet, of course, due to security concerns. So we also would need to address this somehow. They would also like to enable their employees or their customers to be able to easily order items, and that's kind of the main purpose of this use case now, this imaginary use case. And their employees actually handling the orders need to submit status changes. So if the order is shipped, they need to mark it as shipped, or if there's exceptions, they need to mark those exceptions and keep track of those, or actions along those lines. And the customer in this case also has stores in many different locations, or warehouses rather, in many different locations. So we need to grab some geo data as well for all of this to make sense. Now, Another thing here is that they do not want to have this as a static system. They want to be able to easily adapt the data inputs, the outputs, and the manipulation of the data, right? So the actual structure or the schema is not set in stone and it's going to remain the same forever, right? They need some adaptability to this. So this is kind of where NoSQL comes in handy. So NoSQL is a non-relational data structure, and SQL is, of course, a relational database, the classic Microsoft SQL or the traditional databases that you are already used to. So the difference here is that the NoSQL database has a dynamic schema, right? Whereas SQL has a predefined or fixed or a static schema. As well as SQL's databases are not very suited for hierarchical data storage, whilst NoSQL are actually best suited for hierarchical data storage, right? So these databases are best suited for not so complex queries, the NoSQL ones. They are actually built for quite basic queries, so we do not need to calculate a bunch of differences or values in the query we send to the database. The only thing we need to do is essentially to grab and store this specific data. Now, just to add as an asterisk here, you can of course use different types of relationships in NoSQL as well if you want to. But traditional SQL are, of course, pretty much optimized for very complex queries, of course, as well as traditional SQL being vertically scalable. So you would have very large databases, whereas NoSQL aims to more scale horizontally, right? So you would, if you need more data I/O, you would just expand horizontally, and add more servers or more databases instead. So for our use case, in this case, since they want to adapt the data in the future, it would make sense to have a dynamic schema. So that suits our needs very good. They also want to ship off and request very basic JSON data. So the actual queries aren't that complex. We are only gonna grab and send the data in a very simple way, right? So you can clearly tell that NoSQL is also gonna suit our needs very good here. Now, let's have a quick look at the technical concept that we are aiming to implement here. So let me just activate the pen again. There we go. So first off, we would have our Citrix Cloud services. Of course, and in this case, we are also going to use a NoSQL service called restdb.io. It is free for a developer account, and the developer account usually fits your traditional testing type scenarios very good. So I'd recommend having a look at restdb.io if you want to build your own type apps. In Citrix Cloud, we are going to use a few services actually. In this case, we of course are going to use what's called MAS. This is not, for you NetScaler guys out there, to be confused with management and analytics service. This is actually micro app service, right? So we're going to utilize the micro app service. We are going to utilize ShareFile in order to use some custom workflows, because I did mention that we need to grab some more metrics. So we need to scan a barcode because customer wants to, of course, easily be able to order items. So we need to scan a barcode. We need to grab some positional data from the unit. And in order to do that, we do not yet have those features in Workspace, or in the Workspace app rather. So we're going to use ShareFile workflows. Also, of course, to display and manipulate the data, we are going to use workspace. We also, of course, have the employee's phone, and this phone is going to have essentially two different apps. We are talking about ShareFile workflows, and we are also, of course, talking about workspace app. So what's going to happen here, and what's the logical flow that we are trying to build, right? So let's just, for ease of readability, swap the colors a bit. So what we're going to do first is to create a custom workflow. So that's the first thing we're going to do, and that's done in ShareFile. So here we have my ShareFile instance, and I have made a custom workflow with this specific form, and these forms are drag and drop based interfaces, right? So in this case, it's quite a crude and basic form. What we want to do is scan a barcode. This is set to utilize the phone's camera. We need an input field here where the customer can enter the amount of units they might want to order. We're also going to pick up some positional data from the device, and we are also going to add a signature to the actual order. So the input fields in this case are actually quite basic. So once we've actually created the actual data, what we're going to do is, of course, created the actual workflow, we are going to grab the data from the workflow that I just showed you. So what's going to happen is that ShareFile is going to submit this data to RESTDB. So this is going to be stored in the NoSQL database. Once data is stored, we need some way to of course, initiate the sync. We could use the traditional intervals that you set for the micro app service. So specify a time span in between where sync will happen, right? Or I just want to mention that as well. We are working on a webhook API, if that has not already been mentioned, so you can actually trigger this sync. For this demo, we're going to use a bit of a workaround to trigger the sync, but the outcome, once the API is available, would be very similar, right? But we would need to synchronize this data, of course, in between restdb.io and the micro app service. So we're going to sync this data, and we are also going to perform what we call extract, transform, notify, right? So in this case, if whatever fields we've set to matter has been updated or deleted or added or whatever the case might be, right? Then we in turn are going to notify a user or do whatever we prefer with the service, right? So let's, for argument's sake now, pretend that we have actually synced some new data. So once this data has been synced, we are of course going to notify a user, hey, Mr. User, something has happened. So Mass is going to tell the workspace to notify in the workspace app. So the user is going to be notified about this change. Oh, sorry, that's item number 4. So once the user has been notified, the user is going to have a few options. Would I like to manipulate the data, or is this fine? Am I just going to attach a Boolean to this saying that this order is picked, or whatever the case might be, right? So whatever suits the needs for that specific use case. And then, of course, we could in turn add on, sorry about that, let's zoom out again, there we go. We could in turn also attach this RESTDB database to that specific homebrew or open source retail system. to adapt to that data. So that's kind of the basic workflow that we are looking to do here. Now, let's have a quick walkthrough of the solution and guide you through what has actually been built and how all of this works, right? So let's first have a look at the microapps admin and restdb.io. So for RESTDB, in this case, we have a database that is available to us, contains the orders table, right? So in this case, we can supply some data from the ShareFile app. Once that has been synced, we then need to actually build the integration that we are tending to use. So we have built a custom HTTP integration here with, in this case, one simple API data endpoint. So this is going to grab all the data from this specific table. We've loaded up the table structure that we have defined. We have also added a few different service actions, right? So I did mention we want to write back to the database. If there are some exceptions, a user might want to add some comments to whatever work they have done and then submit that, or just tag it as a completed order. And then, of course, there's some basic information around API keys, authentication, and all those details around the actual integration. So once the integration has been built, you would need to add a microapp. In this case, the microapp is displayed as a notification. So let's have a look at the actual microapp. We have the notification in question. So in this case, it's quite basic, of course, for the purposes of this demo. So whenever there's a new record in the retail demo, we are going to create a notification with the card title new order. We're going to have a card body that says, dear email parameter, a new order arrived at date, whatever the date is. And then it's going to look similar to this, right? But in this case, I did mention we also want some service actions. So we're going to attach a page to this notification. So if a user actually clicks on the notification, they are going to be brought to a page. And the page is going to look something along these lines. So if we open up the microapp builder to have a look at the page, hopefully by now you should be somewhat acquainted with the microapp builder. This is where you can drag and drop your data inputs or outputs, right? So in this case, we have just a static image. We have some static text. We then have a flex field containing a few different text fields where we grab the data from the actual sync. And then we have two buttons that actually complete or activates those service actions that I showed you before. So once this has been built, you're going to have a flow that looks something along these lines. So let's have a look at the video here. So as I mentioned, in this case, we are going to use the ShareFile Workflows app. And in the app, we have a few different forms presented to us. In this case, we're going to use the order form that I showed you previously. So we can scan a barcode. We can add a number of units we want to order, grab some positional data, and supply a signature as well. So now this order is going to be processed, and this data is going to be shipped off to RESTDB. So once processed in RESTDB, this would sync at the set interval you have set for this specific integration. But in this case, we have built a Python web scraper just to make this even more complex and less understandable. But the key point here is that we have another REST API that triggers this web viewer that you can see now. So this is only shown for demonstration purposes. but it triggers this web viewer and all the actions are done automatically. So I am not clicking on anything or interacting with the actual web browser in this case. But what it's going to do for us is to sign in to Citrix Cloud, of course. It is going to pick the correct customer that this is actually for. It is going to open up the micro apps service that belongs to this account. Once the actual micro app service has opened, it's going to open up this specific retail integration, as you can see here. And in this case, as you can see, I have the sync set to manually because this specific scraper actually does the action for me, but normally you would have set an interval here. But what it's going to do is to click the actual sync for me. So it's going to sync whatever data is new in the restdb.io database. And once that has been done, in this case, we're going to receive a push notification on our phone. So this phone would of course belong to someone that works at the company and probably at the warehouse, right, where they need to pick the order. So, hey, mister, you have a new order that has arrived. This user in turn clicks the push notifications, opens up the actual micro app notification, and is then displayed with the page that I showed you earlier. So he could go about his work and pick the order, do whatever he needs to do, and can then report exceptions back or report this back as completed. So what we've done here is essentially to create a drag and drop based interface for programming, right? So you define the actual integration, you define the data schema or data structure that integration has, right? Because it's an empty database. You also define the actual micro app. You define the different notifications and rules that surround the micro app, and you essentially build the entire suite needed for this specific use case. So in some sense, it's a very simplified interface to crude programming. So not sure how we are going to handle questions on this virtual session this time, but if we have any questions, go ahead and ask those, and we will of course try to get those replied to. And that was pretty much everything for this session. Thank you for attending. I hope you at least got some new ideas and fresh ideas around what you can actually do with the service and expanded your view a bit. Thank you.